E.T. for the Atari 2600 is something that, well, I wouldn't blame you for thinking that making a video about it is a bit like flogging the proverbial dead horse. Surely it's had quite enough articles written about it, enough videos made about it. Hell, a certain angry nerd with a pocket pouch made a whole damn film about it. It's one of the most famous, or rather one of the most infamous video games ever made. And yet, here we are. Why? Well, because so many of the articles or videos that have covered the game in the 40 plus years since its arrival have misunderstood the game. They've got things wrong, and they've contributed a lot to a rather lazy and inaccurate narrative about the history of video games that still persists today, and may well plunge new and even lazier depths in the near future, particularly when it comes to that big old extinction level event known as the video game crash. And so, I think it's a game that's very much worth digging up and having a little chat about. There's a lot that gets put upon old E.T.'s shoulders, and a lot of that isn't wholly deserved. Firstly, a bit of a refresher on the game itself is perhaps needed, especially because I think to a lot of people it's not exactly clear on just how E.T. is played. It perhaps isn't something that's immediately clear if you were to just boot the game up without really looking up anything beforehand, although it is something that becomes clearer if you play it a bit more, or if you have a quick pore over the game's manual. What we have here is a game released in December of 1982 and created in a mere 5 weeks by the legendary Howard Scott Warshaw, previously the man behind the classic Yars' Revenge, and a man who landed the job specifically thanks to his work on the game for Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's an adventure of sorts, albeit a rather small and simple one that consists of 6 areas. The game's world is basically a cube. E.T. is brought down to Earth in the middle of a forest, and he must find the 3 pieces of his telephone, use them to contact his base, and then return home. He can also collect unspecified chocolatey squares, Reese's Pieces, which he can either eat to regain energy, or give to Elliot in exchange for points or even a piece of the phone if he's got 9 of them, and he must avoid both an FBI agent and a scientist. The former will steal pieces of the phone and even E.T.'s chocolate, while the scientist attempts to take our big-headed hero away for examination and testing, although it's easy enough for E.T. to break out. Usually E.T. needs a bolt of speed in order to avoid these humans, which he can get by holding the fire button down while moving. However, this comes at the cost of expending energy at a faster rate. If you play the game without knowing anything, admittedly it's not likely to leave the best of impressions. Pressing the button while E.T. is standing causes E.T. to stretch his neck and perform a range of actions depending on where he is. For the most part it teleports him to another screen and, well, it's likely that it'll teleport you straight into a pit, or at least close enough to one so that your next move is to fall down it. Either that or you'll just go straight into a pit the moment you enter another screen. In any case, it's going to be mere seconds before you do a Bart Simpson and fall down a well. Video game logic says that pits are bad, but eventually you figure out that holding the button allows you to levitate up and out of them. But unless you know what you really need to do in order to actually leave a pit in the game, you'll keep holding up afterwards and probably fall into it again, and again, and again, and again. The collision detection is annoying by virtue of its absolute accuracy, meaning that if even the slightest scintilla of E.T.'s body is in contact with that hole, you're getting chucked down it. Obviously, this isn't enjoyable. The key to leaving a pit, and this is explained in the manual, is that you need to leave the pit on either the left or the right while holding the button. Doing this allows you to safely float over the hole and continue on. And of course, pits are actually good in E.T. The telephone pieces that you need are down these wells, and they do provide a place to hide if those humanoids are getting a bit too close to you. Therefore, they are necessary in order to beat the game. Still, even if you do get to grips with all of this, the alien's energy will soon run out. Elliot can give him a couple of boosts, but a cursory first play of E.T. without any idea of what to do will likely end with E.T. hibernating outside of poor Elliot's house while the theme plays, with the player likely feeling as though they have achieved absolutely nothing whatsoever. It doesn't exactly provide much in the way of motivation for another playthrough, put mildly. Still, with the help of the manual and a couple of minutes of fiddling around, it doesn't take too long to actually figure the game out. The key, again, is in the actions that ET can perform. You can see what the button's going to do with the help of the icons on the top, which shows you when you're in a power zone. Said power zone is what's used for the aforementioned seemingly random teleporting, with an arrow that shows you the direction ET's going to teleport in, but there's a bunch of other things. An icon that looks like a building sends the humans back to their offices in DC temporarily, another allows you to call Elliot so you can give him your chocolate, and if you give him 9 pieces he'll actually go and find a phone piece for you, while another allows you to eat candy for a boost of energy. A lesser found smiley face icon can appear if you go into a pit and find a wilted flower. If you use this, the flower comes back to life, and you earn an extra life for your trouble. One of the most important icons is the question mark. Use this and ET can actually see if the on-screen pits contain a piece of the phone rather than just randomly falling down the holes. Then there are the two you need to actually win, the call home icon and the landing zone icon. Once you get the 3 telephone pieces and call home, a timer starts, and you need to get back to the forest and find the landing zone. You need to be in precisely that spot when the timer runs out, and if you're there then, congrats, you've completed ET. There is one slight catch though, in that even if you are in the landing zone at the right time, the ship will not appear if another human is on screen. This last bit is probably the best portion of gameplay, certainly the most action-based. The forest doesn't have any pits to hide in, although there is usually one of the send human back zones here, so often a careful mix of avoiding the human and triggering that send human back icon at just the right time is needed in order to make sure the screen's empty, while also giving you enough time to assume the position. Once you're done, you get a score based on your remaining energy and what you did with the candy pieces you collected. You click the button and you start again with the next round. Simple, really. Of course, the trouble is that once you have figured all of this out, there's not exactly a whole lot of impetus to keep going. E.T. is, in the end, a very simple title that doesn't offer much incentive to continue with beyond a couple of successful runs, although there are a few amusing secrets dotted in and around the game that can be discovered by meeting certain conditions, specifically reviving the flower once you've collected a certain phone piece and given Elliot 7 Reese's Pieces. These secrets turn the flower into either the spaceship from Yard's Revenge or Indiana Jones, both callbacks to Howard Scott Warshaw's previous games for Atari. Now of course these Easter eggs are pretty obscure, basically hardly known about curios until they were mentioned by Warshaw many years later. Indeed, people didn't figure out for a long time that the phone pieces are actually made out of the man's initials, a fun little way of including a credit for himself in a time when such things generally weren't allowed. The difficulty switches and game variations don't add a whole lot. Generally they make things easier by removing the scientist and or detective, or allowing Elliot to be present on the screen when the ship arrives. That is a rather awkward way of finishing the game, it must be said, although it is pretty accurate to the film for a 2600 game. So, E.T. is certainly not a good game, although it most definitely doesn't deserve the title of being the worst game ever made or anything like that. For a game that was made by a single person in the space of 5 weeks, the final result is competent enough once you get to grips with what you need to do and how to do it. It was certainly a victim of a bit too much hype. Naturally, Atari marketed it heavily, considering that they'd spent the absolutely whopping sum of around $20 million or so in 1982 money to secure the rights to the game, and they were releasing it in time for the holidays. Steven Spielberg talked about wanting the game to be emotional in the press, something that also seemingly resonated with the author Ernest Cline of Ready Player One fame, who championed the title and talked of its emotions in a 2014 article from Polygon that defended the much maligned title. Mind you, Spielberg himself wasn't initially enamoured with what Warshaw had in mind. In a 2016 interview with the BBC, Warshaw said that Spielberg thought at first that the game should be more of a Pac-Man knockoff. Still, Spielberg did come around to Warshaw's vision. He had, after all, personally hand-picked Warshaw to take on E.T. following his work on Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was a far more complex adventure game than E.T. ended up being. What Warshaw likely didn't mention to Spielberg is that a lot of E.T.'s base came from an unnamed prototype that was kicking about, which Warshaw was able to make use of. If it weren't for that, E.T. may well have not been as fully featured as even the final result ended up being, considering how little time our brave coder had to make it. The aftermath is well known. The game initially sold a whole lot of copies in the holiday season, quickly racking up sales of around 2 million or so, which by itself appears to be a pretty damn good number. Even Wikipedia states, correctly, that initial reviews for the game, while mixed, weren't actually as bad as most people would probably expect them to be. But the game wasn't well received by a lot of customers, a significant chunk of those sales ended up being returned, and in perhaps the most crucial misstep of them all, Atari had manufactured far more copies of the game than they ended up selling, around about 5 million or so from the looks of things, although one source I found gave an utterly astronomical yet surely inaccurate number of 20 million units manufactured. That being the Atari engineer Jerry Jessup, talking to Polygon for that aforementioned 2014 article. Of course, some of those unsold copies, 728,000 cartridges to be precise, including E.T. and several other games such as Raiders of the Lost Ark and Pac-Man, ended up being buried in a landfill in New Mexico, the one that was the stuff of legend until it was found in 2014. It didn't take long for E.T. to become known as video gaming's biggest flop to date, and when the video game crash started to very publicly bite hard in 1983, E.T. ended up taking a lot of the blame, often being mentioned as a direct cause of the market's woes in the press, a misconception that still exists to this day. There's most certainly been a whole load of articles written specifically blaming E.T. for the video game crash in North America, and while the game was a bomb, that is absolutely not the case. E.T. wasn't the cause for the crash as much as it was a symptom of it, for reasons that we'll get into right now. Again, as much as the video game crash has been covered over and over again, yes, it is worth covering, because it's often just not covered properly. Of course, talk of the crash is often frustrating for a Brit like me because it's so often presented as a worldwide event, clearly ignoring the state of play in Europe and Japan. But that's not the only thing that crash coverage tends to screw up, and in these ever crappier times when anyone can lazily type "write me an article about the video game crash" into ChatGPT and immediately be rewarded with 1,000 words of completely inaccurate slop that can then be published or botched up into a video for some cash, it's even more worth it to actually try and properly cover the reasons for the big old downturn. By the time that E.T. was getting ready to hit the shelves at December 1982, the storm clouds had already formed on the horizon. People at Atari looked at the state of play for 1983, and they realised that they were about to lose a whole lot of money. Initial orders for E.T. were a part of that. While retailers did put in a whole bunch of orders for the game around Thanksgiving, basically none of them made any repeat orders. Why? Because they were very wary, and they were tired of Atari mucking them about. Atari had a habit of making games in huge numbers, leaving retailers with a whole load of unsold inventory and ultimately pissing them off. The conversion of Pac-Man, released in April of 1982, was an even bigger example of this, a game where even the 7 million or so copies sold ended up below both Atari's expectations and far below the amount of units they'd manufactured, which was around 12 million, 2 million more than the 2600's actual install base. The poor quality of this conversion did lead to a sizable chunk of games being returned, obviously deeply annoying retailers. They did not wish to have a repeat performance, and so they introduced return policies for the publishers that would force them to buy back unsold copies of their games. In the case of E.T. in particular, this would be a hefty blow for Atari, especially when you consider how much they'd paid for that license to begin with. Bad Game Hall of Fame's E.T. article explains a lot of this in very solid detail, and I'll link to it in the description, but basically, it's not the game itself that caused damage, so much as Atari's awful business practices, and that sure as hell wasn't exclusive to E.T. If Atari had done a better job of projecting sales for their games and manufactured copies accordingly, the blow of something like E.T. may have softened somewhat, but still this game, by itself, certainly was not a cause of the crash. Nor was Pac-Man. Nor, even more ridiculously, was another game that often gets lazily thrown up as a cause for the crash, Chase the Chuckwagon, a licensed maze game that was knocked up at the behest of pet food company Purina in a matter of days, but was merely a silly little folly that was only available through mail order, and thus had absolutely no impact on the market whatsoever. The same applies to various other games that are often considered amongst the system's worst, whether it be other entries in the licensed shovelware pile that were often never intended for mass consumption, or the rhythm games by Mystique that could be found under the counter of your local mom and pop store. Indeed, there's no single game that can really be pointed to as the cause of the crash. The main cause, in truth, was a lack of innovation on Atari's part. By 1983, the Atari 2600, or VCS, or whatever you prefer to call it, was 6 years old, and it desperately needed a proper successor. 1982's 5200 was most definitely not it. It was, after all, essentially a consolised version of an Atari 8-bit computer, and the range of games on offer, slightly upgraded to 2600 titles mainly, didn't exactly excite the market. The only real impact it had was being the reason why many people, including myself, say Atari 2600 today instead of Atari VCS, which, if you didn't know, is what the machine was known as before the 5200's release. The 7800, as originally engineered by the General Computer Corporation, could have been it, but a whole lot of the damage was already done by the time of its announcement in the spring of 1984, and then it ended up not getting released until 1986 anyway, reducing its potential impact to virtually zero. That innovation really needed to come from Atari to keep the market going, to make a proper successor to the 2600 while the going was still good. Now, while people will undoubtedly champion several of the console's competitors, the Intellivision and ColecoVision in particular, the Vectrex as well, none of those were really in a prime enough position to drive that innovation. Atari were the ones who led the market by a very long way, to a point where the oft-repeated tale of the market being oversaturated by hardware and software is also kind of off the mark, because for the majority of consumers, the consoles and games flat out began and ended with Atari. They were dominant. However, a combination of their reluctance to seriously move consoles forward and the mismanagement that plagued the company at all levels were the things that wrecked them, and in turn, that wrecked the video game market in North America. Ultimately, it would be the likes of the Commodore 64 that would take over and eat big chunks out of Atari's market in 1983, as consumers turned their attention to the home computers and left the consoles behind. They were seemingly just another set of toys, a fad whose time in the sun had run out. While that ended up not being the case, people who were there at the time, such as William Hunter, who's written a good article on the crash on Dot Eaters, recall a huge difference between the Christmases of 1982 and 1983, when shelves in department stores that had once been completely full of absolutely everything video games were, 12 months later, completely barren, with only a few monitor cables hanging from the ceiling and white spots where logos had been removed from the walls, acting as evidence that the video games had ever been there at all. It was all over. Until of course it wasn't, thanks to good old Ninty. But again, that's only the case in the States. I could rant now about how British-made articles that talk about there being any kind of crash at all over on these shores, and then credit Nintendo for reviving the UK games market, are the absolute spawn of Satan, and that the authors should be made to pay for their crimes. But that's outside the general topic of this video, and perhaps a subject for another day. But still, hopefully this video paints a more accurate picture of the times, and of a game that, well, again, is not exactly good. It's not something that you should rush out and play right now, but it doesn't really deserve the place that it has in video game history. The flaws and follies of an alien with a big head and a stretchy neck don't amount to a hill of beans in the crazy and awfully run world of early 80s Atari. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.